The year was 1936. Franklin Roosevelt occupied the White House. Europe was sliding toward war, and in a cramped room at 66 College Street, Providence, Rhode Island, a dying man sorted his memories. He did not know he was dying. Not yet. The pain in his stomach had become a constant companion, a dull ache he blamed on canned spaghetti and day-old bread, the meals of poverty. In 14 months, that pain would kill him. But tonight, he was occupied with more pressing business. Howard Phillips Lovecraft sat alone at his desk, past midnight. His aunt slept in adjacent rooms, their gentle breathing of familiar music. Outside, the colonial streets of Providence lay quiet under autumn stars. Before him rose a mountain of envelopes. 45 years of life compressed into paper and ink. He sorted them with methodical precision. One pile to keep, one pile to burn. The small fire in the grate consumed decades of secrets. He watched flames devour page after page, transforming intimate confessions into ash. A fragment curled and blackened, but not before he glimpsed the words, "Must never learn the truth about his father." Think about that for a moment. The man who invented Cthulhu, the man who dreamed of cosmic horror and alien gods, the man whose imagination would eventually reshape 20th century culture. This same man could not bear to let posterity see certain letters, certain truths. What was he hiding? 3 mysteries lurk in those flames. First, what truly happened to his father in a psychiatric ward, and why did the family choose a shameful diagnosis over an honest one? Second, what secrets did his letters to his wife contain? The letters he demanded be destroyed after their separation. Third, who really controlled his literary legacy, and what role did deception play in that theft? This is not a tale of monsters from beyond the stars. This is the story of a man who feared everything in the world except darkness. A man who transformed his terrors into literature that would outlive him by a century. A man whose family demons proved more frightening than any creature he ever imagined. His name was Howard Phillips Lovecraft, born 1890, died 1937, and the truth of his life is stranger than any fiction he wrote. Let us begin where all such stories must begin, with blood, with family, with the sins of fathers visited upon their sons. Chicago, 1893. Grover Cleveland had just begun his second term as president. The World's Columbian Exposition was Young Howard sat on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. His mother occupied the chair by the window, embroidering. She did not look at her husband, who paced the small room like a caged animal. Winfield Scott Lovecraft was a traveling salesman for Gorham Silver Company, one of the finest silverware manufacturers in New England. 39 years old, handsome, well-dressed, losing his mind. The boy did not understand why father spoke so strangely, why his words tumbled over each other, why he stopped mid-sentence, staring at shadows that were not there. Then the screaming began. Winfield collapsed. He thrashed. He howled words that meant nothing, syllables from no language the boy would ever learn. Mother dropped her embroidery. She ran to the door. She called for help. Men in white coats arrived. The boy watched them struggle with father, watched them pin his arms, watched them drag him toward the door. Mother knelt before the child. She covered his eyes with her hands. "Don't look, Howard. Don't look." But he had already seen. Winfield Scott Lovecraft was transported to Butler Hospital in Providence. The diagnosis entered into official records was general paresis. In the medical terminology of the era, this meant one thing: tertiary syphilis. The disease had reached his brain. There was no cure. There was only the slow descent into madness, paralysis, and death. The diagnosis carried devastating social implications. Syphilis was contracted in brothels. It marked moral weakness, secret vice, the betrayal of marriage vows. For a family like the Phillipses, one of the oldest and most respected in Providence, such a diagnosis was catastrophic. But here, in the ashes of history, lies the first mystery. Biographer S.D. Joshi, the foremost authority on Lovecraft's life, has raised careful doubts about the syphilis diagnosis. Medical understanding in 1893 was primitive by modern standards. Misdiagnosis was common. General paresis shares symptoms with other conditions, including hereditary mental illness. Why would a family choose syphilis over hereditary madness? The answer may lie in what they feared more. Syphilis was shameful but external. A man caught it from outside. Hereditary insanity lurked in the blood. It passed from father to son. And could not face it, remains unknown. What we do know, the boy's father did not die in 1893. Winfield Lovecraft would linger in that psychiatric institution for 5 more years. Alive, imprisoned, only miles from his son's home, the child learned the truth eventually, or part of it, in a late letter. He made a cryptic reference to shadows I glimpsed as a child in that place. Had someone taken him to visit? Had he seen his father in the grip of madness, restrained, raving, unrecognizable? The record is silent. The silence tells us something. 1898. Howard was 8 years old when his father finally died. Winfield had spent 5 years in Butler Hospital. 5 years of progressive deterioration. 5 years of a living death that the family never discussed and the child was never permitted to witness. Except perhaps he did witness it. That cryptic reference in his letters suggests something. A visit arranged by his grandfather. A glimpse through a doorway. A face he recognized transformed into something unrecognizable. The evidence was burned. The witnesses are dead. Only questions remain. Howard was told his father had died of exhaustion. A businessman's disease. Nothing shameful. Nothing hereditary. He accepted this story, or said he did, for decades. But the body knows what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Throughout his life, Lovecraft feared insanity. He monitored himself for symptoms. He wrote obsessively about hereditary taints, about bad blood, about the horror of discovering that you are not what you believed yourself to be. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, his protagonist discovers that his ancestry includes inhuman creatures from the sea. The revelation drives the story's horror. But the real terror beneath the fiction is simpler. What if I am my father's son? What if the madness waits inside me? What if I too will end in a hospital bed, screaming at shadows, while my child watches through a crack in the door? Winfield Lovecraft was buried in Swan Point Cemetery. His son would eventually join him there. But in 1898, The boy simply continued his strange, cloistered existence. He read books, he wrote stories, he dreamed of the stars, and he waited, without knowing he was waiting, for the next catastrophe. 454 Angel Street, Providence, a house that would haunt Howard Phillips Lovecraft until his dying breath. After Winfield's hospitalization, the family retreated to this address. It was the home of Howard's maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, a successful businessman, owner of several factories and real estate ventures, a Victorian patriarch of the old school. Within these walls, a peculiar household took shape. 4 women and 1 small boy. The boy stood at the door one morning, reaching for the handle. "Howard, where are you going?" His mother's hand closed on his shoulder. Susie Lovecraft had been beautiful once. Photographs from the 1880s show a delicate face, large eyes, an air of refinement. After Chicago, something in her fractured. "Outside, the other boys are playing. You cannot go out there. You know that. Why? Look at yourself in the mirror. Look at your face. You are hideous. People would be frightened." The boy looked in the mirror. He saw a normal child. Thin, perhaps, pale from too much time indoors, but normal. He did not argue with his mother. He never argued with his mother. Instead, he absorbed her words. He made them part of himself. And for the rest of his life, Howard Phillips Lovecraft believed he was physically repulsive. Photographs tell a different story. The adult Lovecraft was tall, lean, with distinctive but not unpleasant features. Friends described him as striking. Women found him attractive. Sonia Green, who would become his wife, thought him handsome. But he never saw himself that way. His mother's words had carved themselves too deep. Susie did not divorce her husband. Divorce was unthinkable for a woman of her class and time. Instead, she remained married to a madman in an asylum, neither wife nor widow. The strain twisted her into something her son would spend his life trying to understand and escape. She dressed him in girls' clothing until he reached school age. Photographs survive. A small figure in ruffled dresses, long curls carefully arranged. His expression in these images is difficult to read. Resigned, perhaps, or simply confused. Modern psychology has terms for what Susie did: emotional abuse, narcissistic parenting, enmeshment. The vocabulary matters less than the effect. She made him hers, completely, exclusively. The outside world was dangerous. Other people were threatening. Only Mother understood. Only Mother could protect him. Then there were the aunts. Lillian Clark and Annie Gamwell, Susie's sisters. Lillian was cold and practical. Annie was gentler, more sympathetic to the strange child who wandered the hallways speaking of astronomy and ancient Rome. Both women would play crucial roles in Howard's life. Both would, in different ways, become his jailers. And presiding over all was Grandfather Whipple, the only man in the house, the only normal human contact young Howard had. Whipple Phillips was a storyteller. He invented Gothic tales for his grandson, tales of haunted New England villages, of dark secrets in old houses, of things lurking in forests beyond the gaslight's reach. These stories planted seeds that would bloom into nightmares. His library was vast. Young Howard devoured it indiscriminately. Arabian Nights at age 5, Grimm's fairy tales, Greek mythology. By 8, he was reading scientific texts on astronomy and chemistry. By 10, He was producing his own amateur journal, the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy. The boy who would create cosmic horror first dreamed of the stars not as sources of terror, but as objects of wonder. He wanted to be an astronomer. He wanted to map the heavens. Mathematics stopped him. The abstract manipulation of numbers defeated his otherwise voracious intellect. This failure would shape his life as much as any family tragedy. But the library held other books, older books. Grandfather Whipple had inherited texts from earlier generations. Natural philosophy of the 18th century, occult speculation, alchemical treatises. When Whipple died, most of his library was sold to cover debts. Some volumes vanished. Young Howard never mentioned which ones he kept, or what he read in them. 1904, the year everything fell apart. Whipple Van Buren Phillips suffered a stroke. He died on March 28th. Howard was 14 years old. The funeral was held in the house on Angel Street. Howard watched the coffin, watched the mourners, watched his mother weeping with a grief that seemed excessive even for a daughter losing a father. Then came the reading of the will, and the discovery. Whipple Phillips had been wealthy, but wealth in the 1890s was often illusion. His businesses had foundered. His investments had soured. His real estate was mortgaged beyond its value. The house on Angel Street would have to be sold. For Howard, this was not merely a change of address. This was exile from paradise. He had been born in that house. His entire universe existed within its walls. The library where he had discovered worlds. The attic where he staged amateur chemistry experiments. The garden where he played alone, preferring imagination to other children. Now strangers would live there. Strangers would walk the halls he knew better than his own body. The family moved to a small apartment on Angel Street. Still the same street, but everything was different. Cramped rooms instead of spacious chambers. Thin walls instead of solid Victorian construction. Poverty where there had been comfort. Howard would later write about this period with remarkable candor. In 1904, I experienced my first genuine brush with the wish for non-existence. Only the advent of spring and the prospect of astronomical observations restored my desire for life. He was 14 years old, already contemplating suicide, already using intellectual pursuits to keep himself alive. This pattern would repeat throughout his existence. Depression, despair, then distraction through writing, through correspondence, through the things of the mind. His creativity was not merely artistic expression, it was survival mechanism, but no one recognized this at the time. His mother saw a delicate boy who needed protection. His aunt saw an eccentric nephew who would eventually mature. No one saw a child in crisis. They did not have the vocabulary. Mental health in 1904 was not discussed in polite society. You either functioned or you did not. If you did not, you went to Butler Hospital. Like Howard's father, the boy functioned. Barely. He continued his studies. He continued writing. He continued astronomical observations. Something had broken that would never fully heal. 1908. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was 18 years old. He should have been finishing high school. He should have been preparing for Brown University, the prestigious institution mere blocks from his apartment. He had the intelligence. He had the background. He had none of the stability. The official story is simple. Lovecraft suffered a nervous breakdown that prevented him from completing his education. He never graduated high school. He never attended university. This gap in his credentials would embarrass him for life. But what was this breakdown? The term was vague even then. Victorian medicine used it to cover everything from genuine psychosis to what we might now call burnout or anxiety disorders. Lovecraft himself described it as a complete collapse. 5 years, he wrote, lost to darkness. From 1908 to 1913, he essentially ceased to exist as a social being. He did not leave the house. He did not write. He did not correspond. He simply stopped. What caused this collapse? The theories multiply. Accumulated trauma, father's madness, grandfather's death, financial ruin, mother's emotional abuse. Genetic predisposition, the same instability that destroyed Winfield. Social anxiety reaching critical mass. His mother offered her own explanation to neighbors. Howard, she said, suffered from fits. This word would return to haunt him. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Lovecraft attempted to enlist. Not in the American forces, which had not yet entered the conflict, but in the British Army. He believed himself to be of noble English descent. He wanted to serve the mother country. He traveled to the recruitment office. He filled out the paperwork. He prepared to ship out. Then Susie Lovecraft appeared. My son cannot serve. He is fits. He is mentally unfit. The recruitment officer looked at the tall young man before him. He looked at the frantic mother clutching documents. Howard was rejected. We do not know what he said to his mother afterward. We do not know if he raged or wept or simply accepted. The record is silent. The effect is clear. He never tried to enlist again. He never escaped his mother's orbit. He remained her captive, her project, her reason for living. The war continued without him. Young men his age died in trenches while he sat in his Providence apartment, reading books, writing letters to no one. 5 years in darkness. Then, slowly light. 1914. Lovecraft was 24, living with his mother and aunts, producing nothing, contributing nothing, simply existing. Then he read a story in a magazine called The Argosy, a piece of romantic fiction that offended his literary sensibilities. He wrote a letter to the editor, excoriating the author's style in elaborate, pseudo-18th century prose. The letter was published. It sparked controversy. Other readers responded. Lovecraft responded to their responses. For the first time in years, he was engaged with the world. This exchange brought him to the attention of the United Amateur Press Association, a network of hobbyist writers and publishers who produced their own small magazines. They invited him to join. He accepted. It was not a return to normal life. Lovecraft would never have a normal life. But it was a return to life of some kind. He began writing again. Poetry first, then essays, then the weird fiction that would make his name. He began corresponding with other association members. His letters grew longer, more frequent, more elaborate. Within a few years, he was writing dozens of letters per week, then scores. Eventually, he would produce an estimated 100,000 letters in his lifetime. Only Voltaire surpasses him in the history of personal correspondence. The letters were his life. More than his stories, more than his essays, the letters connected him to humanity in the only way he could tolerate, at a distance, through paper, without the terrifying immediacy of physical presence. He sometimes skipped meals to afford postage. A stamp cost more than bread, but bread could not stave off loneliness. Grandpa Theobald, he signed some letters. Epaio. He signed others, masked for a man who did not know his own face. But even as he rebuilt something like a life, the shadow of the psychiatric hospital loomed closer. 1919. Susie Lovecraft was admitted to the same institution where her husband had died. The symmetry is almost too perfect, too cruel. A Greek tragedy transplanted to New England. 26 years separated Winfield's admission from Susie's. The same corridors, the same doctors or their successors, the same barred windows overlooking the Providence landscape. The diagnosis was listed as hysteria and depression, but the symptoms, as recorded in medical notes later examined by biographers, suggest something more severe, possibly schizophrenia, possibly a complete psychotic break. She was 58 years old. She had spent a quarter-century raising a son she both adored and damaged. She had lived as neither wife nor widow, tied to a madman until his death, then tied to the memory of her own failures. Now she had become what she most feared, a patient, an inmate, a person who could not function in the world. Howard visited every week. He took the streetcar to Butler Hospital. He walked the grounds where his father had walked, or been wheeled, or been restrained. He entered the building that had consumed both his parents. What did they discuss, mother and son, in that place? We have no record. No letters describe these visits in detail. The silence is total. Susie Lovecraft died on May 24th, 1921. Complications from gallbladder surgery. She was 64 years old. Howard wrote to his friend Reinhard Kleiner shortly after. The loss takes from me the one link with normal life. A remarkable statement. His mother, who had warped his childhood, who had sabotaged his military service, who had kept him dependent and damaged, was his link to normalcy. Without her, he was adrift, alone for the first time in 31 years. He did not know what to do with freedom. He had never experienced it. The cage had been his entire world, and now the cage was open, and the bird did not know how to fly. For months later, he would meet someone who would try to teach him. Her name was Sonia Green. She was everything his mother had warned him against. And for a brief, doomed moment, she would show him what life could be. His mother was gone. For the first time in 31 years, he was free, and freedom terrified him more than any monster he would ever imagine. The 1920s, the Jazz Age. Prohibition turned speakeasies into temples of forbidden pleasure. Flappers danced at Charleston. America roared with newfound prosperity. And a 31-year-old virgin from Providence met a Jewish immigrant at an amateur journalism convention. Boston, 1921. A rented hall filled with cigarette smoke and cheap coffee. Men in rumpled suits debated printing methods. Women in practical dresses discussed subscription rates. Into this unremarkable gathering walked a woman who was anything but unremarkable. Sonia Halfgreen was 38 years old, divorced, successful, the owner of a fashionable hat shop on Fifth Avenue in New York City. She had been born in the Pale of Settlement, that vast ghetto where the Russian Empire confined its Jewish population. She had survived pogroms, emigration, poverty, a failed marriage, and the death of a daughter. She had remade herself into an American success story. Self-educated, self-made, self-assured. Everything that Howard Phillips Lovecraft was not. She had read his poetry in amateur publications.
She found it impressive. She wanted to meet the author. The man who stood before her was 31 years old, though he looked older, tall and gaunt, with that distinctive lantern jaw and deep-set gray eyes. He wore a suit that had seen better decades. His collar was slightly frayed. His shoes needed polishing. But his mind, his conversation, the way he spoke about literature and history and the stars. Mr. Lovecraft, I am Sonia Green. I have admired your work. He turned the color of brick. His hands trembled slightly. He could barely meet her eyes. You are too kind, Mrs. Green. She was charmed. This brilliant man, this master of strange prose, was terrified of her. Not because she was intimidating, but because she was a woman, because she was real, because she stood before him in 3 dimensions rather than existing safely on paper. Their courtship, if it can be called that, proceeded through letters. Of course it did. Everything in Lovecraft's life proceeded through letters. He could write to her what he could never say aloud. His thoughts on literature, on philosophy, on the cosmic insignificance of humanity. What he could not write about was his feelings. Not directly. Those emerged sideways, in elaborate descriptions of Providence architecture, in lengthy analyses of her stories, in the simple fact that he wrote to her at all. By 1922, they were seeing each other regularly when she visited New England. By 1923, they were discussing marriage. His aunts were horrified. Lillian and Annie had lost their sister to madness and death. They had gained, or retained, their nephew. He was theirs now, their project, their purpose. And this woman from New York, this Jewish immigrant, this interloper, threatened everything. She is not suitable, Howard. She has been married before, divorced. Her background is inappropriate. The objections piled up. Some were spoken. Others hung in the air, too ugly to voice aloud. The Phillipses were old New England stock. They traced ancestry to colonial times. They did not marry immigrants. They did not marry Jews. Howard heard these objections. He recorded them in letters to friends. He did not challenge them directly. He married Sonia anyway. March 3, 1924. A small ceremony in New York. No family present from his side. The aunts refused to attend. They refused to acknowledge the marriage at all. Why did he do it? Why did this man, who feared change, who clung to the past, who shared many of his aunt's prejudices, marry a woman who embodied everything his upbringing taught him to despise? Perhaps loneliness had become unbearable. Perhaps Sonia's warmth and competence offered something his mother never had. Perhaps, at 33, he wanted to discover what normal life might feel like. Or perhaps he loved her, in his limited, damaged way, as much as he was capable of loving any living person. Their honeymoon tells us something about the man. Most newlyweds spend their first days together in romantic pursuits. Howard spent his honeymoon in Philadelphia, retyping a manuscript. The magician Harry Houdini had commissioned him to ghostwrite a story called Under the Pyramids. The original manuscript had been lost on a train. Houdini needed it immediately. The deadline could not be moved. So Howard sat in their hotel room, reconstructing the entire story from memory, while Sonia typed beside him. Page after page, hour after hour, their wedding night consumed by someone else's words. She did not complain. Not then. She understood, or thought she understood, that this was simply who he was. Work came first. Always. What she did not yet understand was that Providence would always come before her. before work, before marriage, before life itself. Brooklyn, 1924. Clinton Street. A cramped apartment in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The newlyweds settled into New York life. Sonia kept her hat shop on Fifth Avenue. Howard looked for work. He had no skills that employers valued. No degree. No experience. No ability to present himself in interviews. He could write brilliant prose. He could discourse on any subject from astronomy to zoology. He could compose letters that readers treasured for decades. He could not hold a job. Application after application. Rejection after rejection. The few interviews he obtained ended in disaster. He could not make small talk. He could not project confidence. He could not pretend to be something he was not. Meanwhile, the city pressed in on him. He stood at the window of their Clinton Street apartment, watching the streets below. Immigrants everywhere. Italians, Jews, Poles, Greeks. Languages he could not understand. Customs he found alien. Bodies packed together in tenements that seemed to breed like organisms. He wrote to Frank Belknap Long, one of his closest friends. The organic things inhabiting that awful cesspool could not by any stretch of the imagination be called human. They were monstrous and nebulous adumbrations of the pithecanthropoid and amoebal. He was describing his neighbors, human beings going about their daily lives, people not so different from his own wife, who had come from similar circumstances. The contradiction did not seem to trouble him. He compartmentalized so completely that he could despise immigrants in theory while loving one in practice. The mind's capacity for self-deception has no bottom. Sonia read these letters. She must have. They were not secret. She knew what her husband thought of people like her family, her ancestors, her community. She stayed anyway. She loved him anyway. Or perhaps she believed she could change him. That exposure to the real world would soften his prejudices. She was wrong. The city broke something in Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Whatever fragile equilibrium he had maintained in Providence dissolved in New York. His weight fluctuated wildly. He gained dramatically, then lost nearly 40 pounds. His clothes hung on him like sails on a becalmed ship. His face grew gaunt. His eyes sank deeper into their sockets. One night, walking home through Brooklyn, he was robbed. Thieves took his only good suit, his wallet, his dignity. He did not report the crime. He simply returned to the apartment and sat in the dark, waiting for Sonia to come home from work. She was supporting them both now. Her hat shop was successful. His writing earned pennies, when it earned anything at all. Weird Tales, the pulp magazine that published his fiction, paid half a cent per word. Often late, sometimes not at all. The story that would become his most famous work, The Call of Cthulhu, was initially rejected by editor Farnsworth Wright. Not commercial enough. Then, in 1925, Sonia's shop failed. Competition, location, the fickle tastes of fashionable women. The result was catastrophe. She had been their sole support. Now she was unemployed. They had savings, but savings do not last forever in New York. Sonia found a job. In Cleveland. Good money. Better than anything Howard could hope to earn. It made practical sense for her to go, but it meant leaving him alone in the city he hated. The city that was destroying him. She went anyway. What choice did she have? Howard remained in Brooklyn. Alone. Unemployed. Surrounded by the masses that haunted his nightmares. He wrote The Horror at Red Hook during this period. A story dripping with xenophobic terror. A story in which the monsters are barely disguised immigrants, their rituals barely disguised ethnic practices, their threat barely disguised racial anxiety. It is not a good story. Lovecraft himself later admitted as much, but it reveals a mind at the breaking point. 1926. Howard Phillips Lovecraft fled New York. He returned to Providence, to his aunts, to the only world that made sense to him. The marriage was effectively over, though neither would admit it for years. Sonia visited Providence several times. She proposed solutions, compromises, a life together in the city he loved. The aunts said no. A Jewish woman will not live in this house. Lillian and Annie had won. They had their nephew back. They would not share him. Howard did not fight for his wife. He did not argue with his aunts. He did not suggest alternatives. He simply accepted their verdict, as he had accepted his mother's verdicts, as he had accepted every verdict imposed by the women who controlled his life. Sonia returned to Cleveland, then to New York, then to other cities, following work where she could find it. They agreed to divorce. The paperwork was drawn up. Sonia signed her portion. Howard never signed his. Whether this was deliberate cruelty, passive aggression, simple negligence, or some complicated emotional attachment remains unknown. He never explained. The documents sat unsigned for years. In 1936, believing herself free, Sonia married Nathaniel Davis, a respectable man, a stable life. Technically, she had committed bigamy. Her first marriage had never been legally dissolved. Think about that. A woman starting a new life, believing her past was behind her, and somewhere in Providence, and signed papers that made her new marriage a crime. Did Howard know? Did he care? Was there some bitter satisfaction in keeping her bound to him, even as she moved on? The record is silent. As always, after Lovecraft's death, Sonia wrote a memoir, The Private Life of H.P. Lovecraft. She published it privately, shared it with scholars, allowed it to inform biographies. But she held things back. There were matters, she wrote, that I could not commit to paper. What matters? What secrets did she carry to her own grave? The letters that might have answered these questions were burned. At Howard's request, Sonia complied. She destroyed years of correspondence, years of intimacy, such as it was. Why did he want them destroyed? What did they contain? The fire consumed everything. Only questions remain. The question of Lovecraft's intimate life has occupied biographers for decades. It illuminates too much of his existence, his work, his fundamental strangeness to ignore. The facts are sparse. He was a virgin until his mid-30s. He married once, briefly. He never had another romantic relationship. His letters express revulsion toward physical intimacy. His wife's memoirs hint at difficulties. The physical side of marriage troubled him, Sonia wrote. But that was not our principal problem. What troubled him? What was the principal problem? She does not say. The matter was too delicate for a woman of her generation to discuss openly. Modern readers have speculated. Asexuality is the most common theory. A simple absence of desire would explain much about his behavior and writing. The complete lack of romance in his fiction, the absence of female characters, the focus on abstract cosmic terror rather than bodily experience. He feared the body, his own body, other bodies, the physical world in general. His horror fiction is remarkably free of violence in the conventional sense. The terror is psychological, existential, cosmic. Bodies transform into alien things. Bodies reveal hereditary taints. Bodies betray the souls that inhabit them. His mother told him he was hideous. Perhaps he believed her. Perhaps he could not imagine anyone truly desiring his physical form. This was the man, brilliant and broken, capable of creating literature that would outlast his century, incapable of sustaining the simplest human connections. He could not connect with people in person, but on paper, he became someone else, someone capable of warmth, someone capable of friendship. The letters were about to become his true life. Let us speak of the men who received those letters, the circle of correspondents who sustained him through his final decade, the community he built, word by word, across vast American distances. In New York, during his miserable years there, Lovecraft had attended meetings of an informal group called the Calum Club. Writers and intellectuals who gathered in apartments and cafes. The name was an acronym of founding members' surnames. The club included Jews. It included homosexuals. It included exactly the sorts of people that Lovecraft, in his letters to others, described with contempt. Yet he attended their meetings. He enjoyed their company. He formed genuine friendships with men whose existence his ideology could not accommodate. Samuel Loveman was a poet, Jewish, gay, a friend of Hart Crane, one of the great American poets of the era. Lovecraft and Loveman corresponded warmly. They embraced when they met in person. How did Lovecraft reconcile this? The private affection and the public prejudice? The individual friendships and the categorical hatreds? The answer is uncomfortable. He did not reconcile them. He held both simultaneously. He was capable of loving individuals while despising their categories, of befriending Jews while writing anti-Semitic diatribes. This is not unusual. History is full of bigots who made exceptions for people they knew personally, who believed their friends were different, who failed to see how their abstract hatreds caused concrete harm. It does not excuse Lovecraft. Nothing excuses prejudice, but it explains something about human psychology, about the capacity for compartmentalization, about the distance between ideology and experience. Frank Belknap long witnessed this contradiction up close. 11 years younger than Lovecraft, he had discovered the older man's work as a teenager. Fan letters evolved into friendship. By the early 1920s, they were meeting regularly. Long saw Lovecraft charm and repel in equal measure. He watched his friend struggle with a world that refused to match his theories. After Lovecraft's death, Long wrote about him extensively. Memoirs, critical essays, attempts to capture the complexity of a man he had known for 20 years. He was not the monster his worst letters suggest, Long wrote, nor was he the saint his admirers claim. He was a human being, damaged, brilliant, trying, in his inadequate way, to make sense of a universe that terrified him. 1926. Lovecraft had returned to Providence. The marriage was over in all but legal technicality. The New York nightmare had ended. He should have been relieved. He was home. His city, his colonial architecture and ancient graveyards and salt-tinged air. Instead, he was devastated. The failure of his marriage confirmed everything he feared about himself. He could not function in the world. He could not hold a job. He could not maintain a relationship. He could not be normal. He was 36 years old, unmarried, for all practical purposes, unemployed. living with elderly aunts in a small apartment. His literary career paid barely enough to cover postage. This was his life. This would always be his life. And yet, the stories he wrote after returning to Providence are among his finest. The Call of Cthulhu, The Color Out of Space, The Shadow over Innsmouth, At the Mountains of Madness. Failure freed him. With nothing left to lose, he could write whatever he wanted. He no longer aimed for commercial success. He aimed only for the vision in his head. That vision was bleak. A cosmos indifferent to human existence. Gods who were not evil, but merely uncaring. Humanity as a brief accident on an insignificant planet. Knowledge is horror. Truth is madness. His own madness, perhaps. His father's madness. The madness of his mother in Butler Hospital. The hereditary taint that haunted his fiction and his nightmares. He wrote it all down. He transformed his fears into literature. He created something that would outlast him by a century. The depression that had swallowed him after his grandfather's death, that had paralyzed him from 1908 to 1913, that had nearly destroyed him in New York, remained a constant presence. He managed it, through work, through correspondence, through long walks in the Providence night. But it never left him. It waited in the margins of his mind, ready to flood back if he let his guard down. He did not speak of it directly. His generation did not discuss such things. Instead, he wrote about cosmic terror, about the horror of knowledge, about minds broken by contact with truth. His fiction was his confession. His monsters were his demons. His alien gods were the depression that haunted him. And his readers, decades later, would recognize something true in his nightmares. Something that spoke to their own terrors. Something that made them feel less alone. This is the paradox of Lovecraft. The racist who created universal literature. The recluse who built a global community. The failure who achieved immortality. He would not live to see any of it. He would die believing himself a disappointment. His work forgotten. His life wasted. But we know better. We know what came after. The friends were scattered across the continent. The magazines paid pennies. But Providence remained. And Providence held one final chapter. The Great Depression, 1931. Breadlines stretched around city blocks. Banks collapsed like houses of cards. A quarter of America was unemployed. And in a small apartment in Providence, Rhode Island, a man who had never held a steady job sat writing letters by candlelight. Not because electricity had been cut off. Because he preferred the atmosphere. 3 in the morning. The ants had been asleep for hours. Howard dipped his pen into the inkwell and began. Dear Robert. He would write until dawn. 7 pages. 10 pages. Sometimes 20. He would skip breakfast to buy the stamp that would carry his words to Texas, to a young man he had never met in person but knew better than most people know their closest friends. 100,000 letters. That is the estimate scholars have reached. 100,000 letters over the course of 23 years. Only Voltaire wrote more personal correspondence in the history of literature. Consider what that number means. Assume an average of 5 pages per letter. That yields 500,000 pages. Enough to fill a small library. Enough to occupy a lifetime of reading. These were not casual notes dashed off between other activities. They were essays, meditations, philosophical treatises disguised as friendly exchanges. A single letter might run 30 pages, covering topics from the geology of New England to the metaphysics of time to detailed critiques of an amateur's first story. The economics were brutal. Stamps cost money. Paper cost money. His income was negligible. Weird Tales paid half a cent per word, when it paid at all. His ghostwriting brought in a few dollars here and there. Yet he chose letters over sustenance, connection over comfort, the minds of distant friends over the needs of his own body. Why? Because the letters were his life. More than the stories that would make him famous. More than the essays and poems. The letters were where he lived, where he was most fully himself, where the masks slipped and the man emerged. He signed them with various names. Grandpa Theobald was a favorite, adopted in his 30s though he would never have grandchildren. Ekpiel was another, a phonetic spelling of his initials. These personas allowed him to be playful, avuncular, affectionate in ways his public self did not permit. His correspondents treasured these letters. They saved them. They shared them with each other. After his death, they donated them to libraries and archives. These letters became the foundation for every biography, every critical study, every attempt to understand the enigma that was H.P. Lovecraft. Without the letters, he would be merely an author of strange tales. With them, he becomes a human being, complicated, contradictory, capable of warmth and cruelty, brilliant and broken. Robert Irvin Howard lived in Cross Plains, Texas, a small town in the middle of nowhere. Oil derricks and tumbleweeds and the endless flat horizon. He was a writer too. Pulp fiction for the same magazines that published Lovecraft. But where the Providence writer created cosmic horror, Howard created muscular adventure. His most famous character was Conan the Barbarian. A warrior. A survivor. Everything Howard himself was not. Because Robert Howard, despite his tales of mighty heroes, was a fragile man. He lived with his parents. He never married. He struggled with depression that could swallow him for weeks. He was, in many ways, Lovecraft's mirror image. A different geography, a different style, the same fundamental isolation. They found each other through the mail. Two solitary men, thousands of miles apart, connected by words on paper. Their correspondence became legendary. Hundreds of letters over 6 years. Debates about civilization and barbarism that could fill a book. Discussions of weird fiction and its possibilities. Arguments about history and philosophy ranging across continents and centuries. From Providence to Texas, 1931. Your vision of barbarism possesses a vitality that my decadent civilizations lack. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps the savage is more honest than the sophisticate. I defend what I do not believe, while you attack what you secretly admire. From Texas to Providence, the same year. Your cosmic entities terrify me more than any demon I have invented. Because your horrors have no motive. They simply exist. That is worse than malevolence. A villain can be defeated. Indifference cannot. They never met in person. Texas and Rhode Island were worlds apart in 1930. Travel was expensive. Time was scarce. The friendship existed entirely on paper. But it was real. As real as any friendship can be. Perhaps more real than most. Because it was built entirely on the exchange of ideas, stripped of the superficialities that often pass for connection. June 11, 1936. Robert Howard sat in his car outside his family home in Cross Plains. His mother lay inside, dying of tuberculosis. She had been the center of his world, as Susie had been the center of Lovecraft's. The difference was that Howard could not imagine surviving her loss. He had written about it to Lovecraft months before. The fear, the certainty that he could not go on. Lovecraft had responded with what comfort he could offer. The small kindnesses of correspondence. It was not enough. Howard had a gun. He put it to his head. The gunshot brought neighbors running. They found him slumped over the steering wheel. He died hours later without regaining consciousness. He was 30 years old. Lovecraft learned of the suicide from newspaper reports. The pulp magazines carried obituaries. Letters arrived from mutual friends, seeking comfort, offering condolences. He could not speak of it easily. His letters from this period mention Howard's death obliquely, painfully. The loss was too fresh, too close to his own terrors. A friend had killed himself rather than face life without his mother. Lovecraft understood this impulse better than he could admit. He had contemplated the same escape after his grandfather's death. He had written about the appeal of oblivion. But he had not acted. Something had held him back. Curiosity, he claimed. The desire to see what science would discover next. The small thread of wonder that connected him to life. Howard had not found that thread, or it had snapped under the weight of his grief. The correspondence ended. The brilliant letters that had illuminated 6 years of creative exchange fell silent. One half of the conversation was gone forever. Lovecraft would follow his friend within a year. But he did not know that yet. He only knew that another light had gone out. Another voice had fallen silent. The circle was shrinking. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Inside, a check for $14. Payment for The Shadow over Innsmouth. A story about a man who discovers his ancestry includes creatures from the sea. A story about the horror of hereditary taint. A story that would one day be considered a masterpiece of American horror fiction. $14. Lovecraft could eat for 2 weeks on that sum. Or he could mail 70 letters. He chose the letters. Weird Tales was never a prestigious publication. Its covers featured lurid paintings of scantily clad women menaced by monsters. Its pages smelled of cheap ink and cheaper paper. Respectable literary critics did not acknowledge its existence. But for writers of strange fiction in the 1920s and 30s, it was the only game in town. The only magazine willing to publish horror and fantasy when mainstream literature had no use for such things. Lovecraft's relationship with the magazine was complicated. He needed them. They needed him. Neither party was entirely satisfied. Farnsworth Wright edited Weird Tales for most of Lovecraft's career. A strange man himself, Wright suffered from Parkinson's disease that made his hands shake uncontrollably. He made editorial decisions that baffled contributors. He rejected The Call of Cthulhu on first submission, the story that would become Lovecraft's most famous work, the story that would spawn an entire mythology. Wright thought it was too long, too slow, too uncommercial. He eventually relented. The story appeared in February 1928. It earned Lovecraft perhaps $30, a sum worth roughly $500 in today's currency. $30 for immortality. The economics of art have always been absurd. Lovecraft complained about Wright in letters to friends. The low pay, the late payments, the incomprehensible rejections followed by inexplicable acceptances. But he continued submitting. What choice did he have? The mainstream magazines would not touch his work. Literary fiction in the 1930s meant realism, social commentary, the concerns of ordinary life. Cosmic horror had no place in the pages of The Atlantic or Harper's, so he published in pulp magazines, alongside stories he considered trash, surrounded by advertisements for bodybuilding courses and patent medicines. His carefully crafted prose reduced to cheap entertainment, or so he thought. What he could not know was that those readers would remember. They would grow up and become writers themselves. They would cite his influence, adapt his ideas, spread his vision to audiences he never imagined. A boy in Maine read his stories and grew up to become Stephen King. A painter in Switzerland named Geiger saw his visions and designed the monster for Alien. A director in Mexico named Del Toro built a career on his foundations. The pulp magazine that Lovecraft despised became the seedbed for his immortality. The cheap paper preserved words that marble monuments could not have protected better. This is often how influence works, not through prestigious publications and critical acclaim, but through the despised, the popular, the vulgar, through stories that reach readers when they are young and hungry for wonder. Lovecraft reached those readers in cramped apartments and small-town libraries, on trains and buses, in stolen moments between work shifts. He gave them something they could not find elsewhere: visions of cosmic strangeness, terrors that dwarfed human concerns, a universe vast and indifferent and magnificent. They never forgot. They passed the stories to their children. They created new works carrying his influence forward. The failure became a classic. The obscure writer became a monument. One peculiar detail has puzzled fans for decades: the pronunciation of his most famous creation, Cthulhu. How did he say it? In a letter to a curious correspondent, Lovecraft offered guidance. The best approximation one can make is Cthulhu. The first syllable guttural, almost coughed. The second a long vowel rising. Nothing like the Cthulhu that most English speakers default to. He was clear that no human vocal apparatus could truly produce the sound. It was meant to be alien, unpronounceable, a word from outside human experience forced into inadequate letters. This attention to linguistic detail reveals something about his craft. He thought carefully about how invented words would sound, how they would feel in the mouth, what associations they would trigger. The name Cthulhu evokes something oceanic, something vast and patient, something that waits in depths beyond light. Lovecraft hated the sea. He hated seafood. The texture of fish flesh revolted him. The smell of the ocean triggered something like nausea. And yet his most powerful imagery involves water. Submerged cities, things that rise from depths. The Pacific Ocean as a space of unimaginable threat. Perhaps he wrote about what he feared. Perhaps the revulsion fueled the horror. The visceral disgust translated into cosmic dread. This is common among horror writers. They do not write about what they find pleasant. They write about what keeps them awake, what lurks at the edge of comfort, what they cannot bear to face directly, so they face it through fiction. Lovecraft's fears were many: the ocean, immigrants, his own heredity, the vastness of the cosmos, the insignificance of human life, the possibility that everything he believed about himself was wrong. He transformed these fears into literature, made them external, gave them form, named them with unpronounceable names. And readers recognized the fears, not the specific prejudices, necessarily, but the underlying terror. the sense that the universe is stranger and more dangerous than we can comprehend, that our certainties are illusions, that something waits in the dark. August Derleth was a young man from Wisconsin when he first wrote to Lovecraft, barely out of his teens, ambitious, talented, determined to make his mark on weird fiction. Lovecraft encouraged him, as he encouraged so many young writers. He offered detailed critiques. He shared techniques and theories. He welcomed Derleth into the expanding circle of correspondence. Derleth was a quick study. His stories appeared in weird tales alongside his mentors. He adopted the Lovecraftian style, the references to forbidden books and sleeping gods. He became, in a sense, a disciple. But disciples sometimes betray their masters, or believe they honor them while distorting everything they taught. When Lovecraft died in 1937, his literary estate was in chaos. He had left no will. His copyrights were uncertain. His manuscripts were scattered among friends and family. Two men stepped forward to claim the legacy. August Derleth and Donald Wandre announced they were Lovecraft's literary executors. This was not true. Lovecraft had designated Robert Barlow as his executor, a young man from Florida who had become close to the writer in his final years. Barlow had documents. He had explicit instructions. But Barlow was young, uncertain. He was also, though few knew it then, homosexual in an era when that identity was criminalized. Derleth was older, more confident, more aggressive. He simply asserted his claim and dared anyone to challenge it. No one did. Barlow retreated. He eventually became an anthropologist, moved to Mexico, built a distinguished academic career. In 1951, faced with blackmail over his sexuality, he took his own life. What survived was Derleth's version of the legacy. He founded Arkham House, a small press dedicated to preserving Lovecraft's work. In this, he performed invaluable service. Without Arkham House, Lovecraft's stories might have remained buried in crumbling pulp magazines. Forgotten, lost. But Derleth did more than preserve. He edited. He revised. He wrote his own stories and presented them as collaborations with the dead writer. He fundamentally altered the philosophy underlying the fiction. Lovecraft's cosmos was indifferent. His alien gods cared nothing for humanity. There was no good and evil in cosmic terms. Only vast forces beyond human comprehension. Derleth introduced benevolent deities. He created a moral framework where none had existed. He turned nihilistic horror into cosmic adventure, with heroes who could fight back against darkness. This was not what Lovecraft intended. Scholars have spent decades untangling Derleth's contributions from original work. The Cthulhu mythos, as popularly understood, owes as much to the disciple as to the master. Was Derleth a thief or a savior? Did he preserve Lovecraft's legacy or corrupt it? Both, perhaps. The answer depends on what you value. The survival of the work, however altered, or its integrity, however obscure. Lovecraft himself might have appreciated the irony. His fiction dealt constantly with texts copied, translated, corrupted across centuries. The Necronomicon that appears in his stories is always a copy of a copy, each version introducing new errors. His own work suffered the same fate, preserved by the very process that distorted it, transmitted through hands that could not help but leave their marks. Later generations would rediscover his original vision. Scholars would strip away editions. Readers would seek out authentic texts. But the distortion persists. The popular image of his mythology still bears Derleth's fingerprints. The war between good and evil that Lovecraft explicitly rejected remains embedded in adaptations and interpretations. The master's voice is muffled by the disciples' enthusiasm. Let us return to the man himself, alone in his Providence apartment, writing letters by night, struggling with poverty and obscurity. The year was 1936. He was 45 years old. His health was failing, though he did not yet understand how seriously. Robert Howard was dead. Suicide in June. The shock still fresh. Others were drifting away. Clark Ashton Smith in California wrote less frequently. Derleth in Wisconsin was busy with his own career. The circle contracted. Only the letters remained constant. The daily ritual of correspondence. The pouring of self onto paper. He wrote to strangers who sent fan mail. Detailed replies to people he would never meet. Generous attention to aspiring writers seeking advice. Why? What did he gain from these exchanges? Connection, obviously, but something more. A sense of purpose. A feeling that his experience and knowledge could help others. He had failed at so much. School, career, marriage. The ordinary markers of adult success had eluded him entirely. But he could help young writers. He could share what he had learned through decades of practice. He could be useful. The letters to amateurs are among his most generous. He offered detailed critiques without condescension. He praised what deserved praise and gently corrected what needed correction. He encouraged persistence in the face of rejection. This was the man behind the horror. Not a monster, not a saint. A human being trying to make meaning from a life that had given him little. His stories dealt with meaninglessness, with a cosmos indifferent to human hopes, with the horror of insignificance. But his life contradicted his philosophy. He kept writing. He kept connecting. He kept trying. If existence was truly meaningless, why bother? Why not simply stop? He had contemplated stopping. At 14, at 18, perhaps at other times he never mentioned. Something held him back. A flicker of curiosity. A stubborn refusal to surrender. A thread of wonder that would not break. Perhaps this is the deepest truth about Lovecraft. Not the nihilism of his fiction, but the persistence of his life. The daily choice to continue despite everything. He did not believe existence had purpose, but he lived as if it did. He created. He connected. He contributed. We are all contradictions. We all live between what we believe and what we do. We all find reasons to continue when reason itself offers none. Lovecraft found his reasons in letters, in the faces of distant friends glimpsed through words on paper, in the small community he built against the vastness of the void. 100,000 letters. 100,000 threads connecting him to humanity. It would have to be enough. It was all he had. Providence remained. And Providence held one final chapter. 1936. Europe trembled on the edge of catastrophe. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland. Civil war erupted in Spain. The shadow of the next great conflict fell across the Atlantic. And in Providence, Rhode Island, a man walked the colonial streets at night, searching for ghosts. Providence was not simply where Howard Phillips Lovecraft lived. Providence was what he was. Other writers have loved their cities. James Joyce in Dublin, Dickens in London, Balzac in Paris. but none achieved the complete identification that Lovecraft felt with his New England home. He walked its streets after midnight like a spirit among spirits. The ancient buildings along Benefit Street, the burying grounds were 17th-century headstones tilted at drunken angles. The waterfront where clipper ships had once unloaded cargo from China and the Indies. He knew the city's history better than most historians. He could date buildings by architectural details. He could recite names of families who had lived and died in houses he passed. He could trace the street layout through centuries of change. This was not mere antiquarianism. This was something closer to mysticism. He believed that place held memory, that stones absorbed experiences of those who touched them, that walking old streets allowed communion with the dead. The Athenaeum Library on Benefit Street became his sanctuary, a beautiful Greek Revival building, founded in 1836. Edgar Allan Poe had visited there, courting a local poetess. Lovecraft sat in the same reading rooms, turning the same pages, breathing the same air. He felt closer to Poe than to any living writer. Both men had struggled with poverty and obscurity. Both had created new forms of horror. Both had lived haunted lives. Poe died at 40, under mysterious circumstances in Baltimore. Lovecraft would die younger still. The pattern holds a grim symmetry. He created maps of an imaginary Providence overlaid on the real one. Arkham, his fictional city, borrowed streets and buildings from his actual home. Careful readers could trace descriptions to specific locations. The witch-haunted gambrel roofs, the narrow lanes climbing College Hill, the river winding through industrial districts. Fiction and reality blurred. Perhaps they always had for him. Perhaps the boundary was never clear. One night in the early 1920s, young Howard Phillips Lovecraft committed his only recorded act of trespass. The First Baptist Church of Providence stood on North Main Street. Founded in 1638, making it one of the oldest Baptist congregations in America. The current building dated from 1775. Its steeple dominated the skyline. Inside was an organ, a magnificent instrument played at services for generations. Lovecraft, for reasons he never adequately explained, decided he wanted to play it. He did not know how to play the organ. He had no musical training beyond basic appreciation. But something about the instrument called to him. Something about the empty church at night. He found a way in. Through an unlocked door, perhaps, or a window left ajar. The details are unclear. What is clear is that he reached the organ loft and sat down at the console. The song he intended to play was, "Yes, We Have No Bananas." Not a hymn, not Bach or Handel. A popular novelty song from 1923. A ridiculous tune that had swept the nation that summer. Why this song? A joke? A rebellion against the sacred space? A moment of absurdist whimsy from a man not known for whimsy? We only know what happened next. He could not figure out how to turn the organ on. The instrument sat silent. He pressed keys that produced no sound. He pulled stops that did nothing. The great pipes remained mute. Then the sexton appeared, an elderly man, making his rounds, checking the building before bed. He found a tall, strange-looking figure sitting at the church organ in the middle of the night. The conversation that followed was not recorded. The outcome was clear. Lovecraft was escorted out. Not arrested. Simply, firmly, sent on his way. He never spoke of the incident publicly. We know of it only through letters to close friends. where he recounted the episode with self-deprecating humor. This is the only documented comedy in a life defined by tragedy. The cosmic horror writer, defeated by a church organ. The master of dread, attempting novelty songs. The nocturnal ghost of Providence, caught and expelled like a common vandal. It humanizes him, reminds us that behind the elaborate prose and grim philosophy was a man capable of foolishness, of impulse, of ordinary absurdities. We need these reminders. It is too easy to reduce Lovecraft to his darkness. But the darkness cannot be avoided. It must be faced directly. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a racist. This is not modern sensibilities imposed on a historical figure. It is simple fact, documented in his own words, evident to his contemporaries, acknowledged by everyone who has seriously studied his life. His prejudice exceeded the casual bigotry common to his era and class. It reached pathological intensity. It expressed itself in language that shocked even other white Americans of the 1920s. In 1912, he wrote a poem too offensive to quote here. The title alone is unprintable. It circulated only in private correspondence. But he wrote it. He thought it. He committed it to paper. His letters from New York overflow with hatred for the immigrants he saw daily. Italians, Jews, Poles, Greeks. He described them in terms more suited to vermin than human beings. He wrote The Horror at Red Hook during this period, a story in which the monsters are barely disguised immigrants. Their rituals are ethnic practices viewed through terror. Their very existence is the horror. It is his worst story. He later admitted as much. But it reveals the depth of his fear. He feared the other, all others, anyone different from his idealized image of old New England stock. And yet, his wife was Jewish. His friends included Jews. Samuel Loveman, whom he embraced at their meetings. Sonia Green, whose life he shared. He attended gatherings where homosexuals and immigrants sat as equals. He maintained correspondence with writers of various backgrounds. He encouraged talent wherever he found it. The contradiction is not resolvable. He held both positions simultaneously. He loved individuals while hating categories. He befriended people while despising their peoples. This is common among bigots. It does not excuse anything, but it explains the mechanism of prejudice. How hatred operates through abstraction. How individuals become exceptions to rules that remain somehow valid. His views on Hitler evolved. In the early 30s, he expressed admiration for the Nazi regime's defense of German culture. This was not unusual among American conservatives before the full horror became clear. After 1933, after the first anti-Jewish laws, after violence became undeniable, Lovecraft pulled back. He condemned the persecution. He recognized something monstrous in what Germany had become. This was not complete transformation. His personal prejudices remained. But he could not endorse organized brutality against people who included his ex-wife and his friends. Some see this as growth, evidence he might have continued to evolve. Others see mere squeamishness, distaste for open violence rather than genuine change. We cannot know what he might have become. Death fixed him at 46. His views remained frozen in 1937. What we can say is this: his fiction transcends his prejudices. The cosmic horror he invented speaks to universal human fears, the insignificance of humanity before vastness, the fragility of sanity. the terror of discovering that everything we believe is wrong. These themes do not belong to any race or nation. They belong to the human condition. Readers from every background have found meaning in his work. Writers from every culture have built on his foundation. The mythology he created has become global. Art can outlive its creator's failures, can speak truths the artist could not see, can reach audiences the artist would have despised. This is the paradox. The provincial who imagined infinite cosmos, the bigot who created universal literature, the man who feared everything different and gave that fear a form connecting across all differences. We hold both truths. We refuse to choose between them. This is what honesty requires. When Howard was 5 years old, his mother told him the truth about Santa Claus. The Jolly Man in Red was a story, a comfortable fiction for children. The boy considered this information. Then he asked the logical follow-up. What about God? Susie had no good answer. She was nominally Christian, but not devout. She had not expected her 5-year-old to make the connection so quickly. Howard made his own conclusions. If Santa was fiction, why not God? Why not heaven? Why not the whole apparatus of religion? By his own account, he was an atheist before he entered school. This did not mean he lacked interest in religion. He read mythology voraciously. Greek gods, Roman gods, Norse gods, Egyptian gods. He knew their stories better than most believers knew their own scriptures. For a brief childhood period, he decided to worship the Greco-Roman pantheon, not as literal belief, but as aesthetic preference. If one must have gods, let them be beautiful and terrible. This phase passed. By adolescence, he settled into materialist atheism. The universe was matter and energy governed by physical laws. No gods existed. No afterlife awaited. Consciousness was brain chemistry, and death was simply the end. Most atheists of his era became optimists. They believed in progress, in human reason, in gradual improvement through science. Lovecraft became a pessimist. He looked at the cosmos revealed by astronomy and saw not opportunity, but horror. The vast distances, the inhuman scales of time, the utter indifference of physical law to human hopes. His fiction expressed this vision. The universe he created was godless, but not empty. Entities existed that dwarfed human comprehension. They were not supernatural. They were merely alien. Their existence obeyed physical laws beyond our understanding. Cthulhu was not a demon in the religious sense. Cthulhu was simply a creature of unimaginable age and power. Humanity meant nothing to it. We were beneath notice, irrelevant to its concerns. This is cosmic indifference. Not evil, but something worse. Complete absence of meaning at the largest scales. He found freedom in this vision. If nothing matters cosmically, then everything matters locally. Human life gains significance precisely because the universe will not provide it. We make our own meaning, or we have none. The man who believed in nothing created one of the most influential mythologies of the 20th century. The atheist invented gods more compelling than any traditional deity. They demanded nothing. They offered nothing. They simply were. This is more honest than most theology. Readers sensed that honesty. They responded even when they could not articulate what drew them. Lovecraft gave form to the modern condition, the sense that old certainties have collapsed, that we float in a void our ancestors never imagined. He did not create this condition. But he expressed it, and his expression endures because the condition endures. We are still floating. We still lack the certainties our ancestors enjoyed. His maps remain useful, even now. The pain grew worse through 1936 and into 37. He ignored it as long as he could. Bad diet, canned food, the price of poverty. These explanations satisfied him, or he forced them to satisfy. The pain did not stop. It intensified. It spread. In February 1937, he finally consulted a physician. The diagnosis was cancer, specifically cancer of the small intestine. The disease had spread. Surgery was not an option. Treatment was not an option. He had weeks to live, perhaps a month. The news might have destroyed another man, triggered despair, rage, denial. Lovecraft responded with characteristic precision. He began keeping a journal of symptoms, daily entries recording the disease's progression, scientific observations of his own deterioration. This was how he faced death, as an observer, documenting the process even as it consumed him. He continued writing letters. Most correspondents did not know he was dying. He did not tell them. The letters maintained their usual tone. Literature, current events, small exchanges that had filled his life. Only to a few did he reveal the truth. Even to them, he maintained detachment. This was happening. He was observing it. What else could one do? The last weeks were spent in Jane Brown Memorial Hospital, Providence, the same city where he had been born, the same city he had loved beyond reason. Visitors came. His Aunt Annie, a few friends close enough to reach him. They found him lucid, calm, resigned. He did not rail against fate. He did not beg for more time. He accepted the ending as he had accepted so much else, with exhausted grace. The final letter was dated March 14, 1937, one day before the end. The pain is unceasing. I cannot eat. I can barely hold a pen, but I write while I can still write. March 15, 1937. The Ides of March. A date that would have pleased his classical sensibilities. Julius Caesar died on this day. Now Howard Phillips Lovecraft joined him. He was 46 years old, never held a steady job, never finished school. His marriage had failed. His work remained obscure. By conventional measures, his life was a failure. But conventional measures missed the point. They buried him in Swan Point Cemetery, the same ground where his parents lay. The Phillips family plot, established generations before. He did not have his own headstone. The family could not afford one. He was buried in a corner of the plot, marked only by the shared family monument. For 40 years, this remained the case. Visitors seeking his grave found nothing to find. Then, in 1977, admirers raised funds for a proper marker. The stone bears a simple inscription, his name, his dates, and a quotation from one of his letters. I am Providence. 3 words capturing everything. The identification with place. The stubborn assertion of identity. The claim to significance that his life seemed to deny. The stone stands now among older monuments. Visitors leave offerings, coins, flowers, small Cthulhu figurines from gift shops, trinkets of a cult he never knew he was founding, because something happened after his death, something he could not have predicted. August Derleth and Arkham House published collected fiction. A few copies sold, then more. Word spread among readers hungry for something different, something strange. The 1960s brought revival. Paperback editions reached mass audiences. College students discovered the strange tales from Providence. The influence spread beyond horror, beyond literature entirely. The artist Geiger drew on Lovecraft for his designs in Alien. The xenomorph carries his DNA. Video games embraced his mythology. Call of Cthulhu became tabletop games, then video games, then franchises. Directors like Guillermo del Toro and John Carpenter cited him as primary influence. Their films reached millions who never read a word he wrote. Today, Cthulhu is everywhere. On shirts and coffee mugs, in cartoons and comedies. The horror domesticated, made cute, turned into mascot. Lovecraft might have been appalled, or amused. The universe is indifferent, after all, even to its prophets. What matters is that he is remembered, not as he was. No one is remembered as they were, but as something, a name evoking a feeling, a style that changed what horror could be. The failure became immortal. The obscure writer became a classic. The man who died alone and poor now centers a global phenomenon. This is not justice. There is no justice in how reputations rise and fall. But it is something. He made something that outlasted him. Something outlasting his prejudices and failures and pain. Something speaking to readers he could not have imagined. 1936. 66 College Street, Providence. We return to where we began. The gaunt man at his desk. The pile of letters. The small fire in the grate. The pain in his stomach is a dull presence he has learned to ignore. He does not yet know it will kill him. He knows only that letters must be sorted, that some things must burn. The flames consume page after page. Secrets we will never know. Confessions we will never hear. He saves some letters, destroys others. The selection seems arbitrary, but nothing was arbitrary with him. He had reasons. They died with him. One letter, perhaps, he reads again before deciding. Folds it. Sets it aside. Not for burning. Not quite for saving. For something else. What did it contain? We tell ourselves stories about lost documents. The letter explaining everything. The confession of his father's true illness. The acknowledgement of feelings he could never express. These stories are probably false. Probably the lost letters contain nothing more dramatic than those surviving. Probably the burning was simply housekeeping. But we want the mystery. We need the mystery. A life without secrets is a life without depth. Lovecraft understood this. His fiction is built on secrets. Forbidden knowledge. Truths too terrible to speak. He gave us the architecture of mystery. Then he enacted it. He became his own Lovecraft story. The author as unreliable narrator of his own life. The fire burns down. The ash cools. Outside, Providence sleeps under winter stars. The colonial streets he loved. The graveyards he haunted. The libraries and churches and crooked lanes. He belongs to them now. Always belonged to them. Soon he will join them completely. Another ghost among ghosts. But his words will escape. His nightmares will spread. His vision will colonize minds not yet born. The man is dying. The work is just beginning. We are small. The universe is vast. And the gap between what we think we know and what exists may be unbridgeable. This is not comforting. Lovecraft offered no comfort. But it is honest. And honesty, even terrifying honesty, has its own value. He wrote until he could not hold the pen. He connected until there was no one left to reach. He created until creation itself was taken from him. And in the end, that was enough. It was everything.